Would you like to introduce yourself, so?
My name is Katharine Hayhoe. I am a climate scientist and a professor at Texas Tech University.
What do you think about the Sustainable Development Goals?
So the United Nations has a set of sustainable development goals that are very basic. Eliminating poverty, addressing hunger, healthcare, education for all, gender equality. Number 13 on that list is climate action. But here's the thing. I don't think it should even be on that list at all. Why? Because the only reason we care about climate change is because it affects every single other thing on that list. I care about climate change because it affects poverty and hunger. It affects women and children disproportionately. It affects our health and our educational systems. It affects the economy. It affects the life in the oceans and the life on land. It affects every single sustainable development goal. The best description that I've ever heard of climate change comes from the US military. They call it a threat multiplier. And I think that's perfect because it takes all of the threats that the Sustainable Development Goals address and it is multiplying or exacerbating almost every single one of them, and that's why we care.
You're here for 2 talks today in UCC, and if you could explain a little bit about those topics for us today.
So how do we respond to climate change? People often argue, should we reduce our carbon emissions or should we just adapt to future change? The answer is both. Because the more we reduce our emissions, the less adaptation is required. And the third choice is suffering.
And what do you think we can do locally, nationally, to bring about those big changes?
To fix climate change, we really need system-wide change. Individually, our choices are not enough to fix climate change as individuals, but a system is made up of individuals. So one of the most powerful things we can do is use our voice to advocate for change. Reduce our own carbon footprint, because you can't exactly talk about something if you don't do it yourself, but then talk about how we need these large-scale solutions at the level of the university, the town, the county, and the country. We are not doing enough yet, but we're moving in the right direction. So for a long time, climate change seemed like a boulder that we were trying to roll uphill like Sisyphus in the Greek legends. And now that boulder is starting to roll downhill. It's not rolling fast enough. We still need more hands on the boulder to make it go more quickly, but it is starting to head in the right direction.
And what do you think, even though the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement?
Not yet. They can't officially pull out until the end of this year.
What do you think could be done if they do pull out?
What many people don't realize is that there's an organization called We Are Still In the United States, and cities, states, universities, tribal nations, businesses, and corporations that represent almost 50% of US emissions are part of the We Are Still In movement. So almost 50% of the US is still in on the Paris Agreement, just not the other 50% because the country has decided to pull out. So there still is hope, and interestingly, even under President Obama, in his second term, climate change was one of his main focus areas. But even with everything that he could do as president, it was still only very small changes that he could make because he had a divided Senate and Congress. They were not in agreement. So even under a president who wants to do everything, that isn't enough either. You really need everybody on board. And so that's why talking about climate change solutions in the US, as a scientist, I don't care what they are as long as they cut carbon and they help people. But when I talk about them in the US, I focus a lot more on the conservative solutions to climate change because those are the people who need to be brought on board. And the reason they're not on board is not because they really truly doubt the science. I know they say they do, but they don't really. If they really doubted the science, they wouldn't use refrigerators or stoves or airplanes because it's the same science. It's because they don't think there are any solutions that are consistent with their values. So talking about conservative solutions is one of the most important things that I do in the US because that's what's keeping people from joining the movement.
And what do you think the youth can do? Do you think they can be a big part of the climate change action?
The single most important thing that any of us can do about climate change is use our voice to advocate for change. And young people can do that just as, if not more effectively than adults. So people used to say, I'm just one person, what can I do? But now we know that all you have to do is something so simple. Whether it's taking a piece of white cardboard and painting some words on it and going and sitting outside a building, 2 years later, everybody in the world knows your name, and it's Greta.
Yeah.
So based on that example, we know that no one is too small to make a difference, and our children today are really leading the way.
And what would your opinion be on the intergenerational divide, as some people believe that it's the fault of previous generations and that it's theirs to fix?
Climate change is an essentially unfair issue. So 10% of the world's richest people produce 50% of emissions. 85 countries produce so few emissions, they're such low emitting countries, that they are essentially making negligible contributions to the problem, yet they will bear the brunt of the economic and the human impacts of climate change. And then there's the generational issue where those of us in the past produce more and those in the future are going to have to deal with the impacts. The reason why I study climate change is because it is so unfair and because those who are most affected by it have the least ability to raise their voice for change at this time. But that's why we need to fix it, because it isn't fair, because it affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world more than the richest, because it affects future generations more than us. That's why we have to fix it. And that's why it's not only about the science, it's about the ethics and the morality of this issue too.
What do you believe should be the consequences of not reaching targets? Do you think there is a scientific way in order to help people reach those targets? Is there a more economical way in reaching those?
There isn't a scientific way because the science just tells you have a problem.
Yeah.
That's what the science does. And the science says that if we reduce our emissions by this much, we can avoid this much damage. But how do we encourage people to do that? There can be peer pressure. There can be shaming. There can be border tariffs. There can be fines. There can be sanctions. There's many economic ways to do it, but the science doesn't tell us what the right way is. That's really up to us.
Okay. I know a lot of your climate change is in correlation to Christianity. Could you explain the relation and the relationship there?
So science can tell us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and every gigaton of carbon that we produce carries a price. But the science can't tell us what's the right thing to do. This technology or that, this policy or that one, how fast, how much. That's not about the science. That's about more what's in our hearts, what we value, what we care about most. And for many of us who, around the world, the large majority of us belong to a religious tradition, and nearly every single major world religion has at its core the idea of being stewards or caretakers of this planet that we live on, and also for caring for the poorest people who don't have the advantages that we have. So for those of us who do belong to a faith tradition, that's a huge part of what we use, the values we use to make decisions about climate change, and that's why it's so important to directly link them.
You have been recently awarded an honour from the Young Women's Christian Association, which is our sister organisation. And would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I was very honoured to be named one of their Women in Science from the YMCA. In my field, by the time you become a full professor, only 13% of us are women. And that's because there's such a large attrition in our career. Many more women enter, but a career in science is often really not set up for people who have families and children and who are not available after certain hours. And so I really appreciate their recognition and their encouragement for me as a woman in science, especially in such a contentious field as climate change.
Does your recognition give you more incentive to help climate change even more?
I would say that the recognition gives me even greater incentive to reach out to other women. Yeah. So I serve on the advisory board of an organization called Earth Science Women's Network that represents thousands of women in earth science around the world. And it's all about encouraging women to enter earth sciences, but also to stay in earth sciences. Because the social science shows us that the more diversity of opinions and backgrounds and experience and expertise we have, the more robust solutions we can come up with. And what bigger problem do we have than climate change? So we need everybody at the table of all, genders, cultural backgrounds, races, even ages. We need a huge diversity of people studying this issue, and women are a big part of that.
Thank you very much.